Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the Omnibus. And tonight we have the most wonderful Bigfoot encounter coming to us from Robbie from somewhere in North America. So let's get started. It's a fantastic story. It's called Bigfoot Killed My Dad. Dear Sarah, I have an extraordinary tale to tell you what happened to me when I was only an 11-year-old boy. It's a story that I've never told anyone before, and I rarely thought I would be taking this story with me to my grave. It is a gruesome account of what happened to my father in the hands of the hairy monster, otherwise known as Bigfoot. I grew up in the early 50s, in a very rural small town in North America. In those days, our town was not built up like it is today. As you can appreciate, I do not want to divulge the exact area where I lived or grew up, if you do not mind. I lived in a very beautiful part of the world, that is what I will tell you, where there were plenty of dirt roads. The rugged terrain around our humble little log cabin was wild and remote, littered with large, magnificent forests of white pine, cedar and spruce. There was an abundance of wildlife scattered everywhere in those days, with creatures like bear, moose, elk, whitetails, wild hogs, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, hares, eagles, ravens, and you name it, we had it all. You might think that living in such an idyllic location that I had a very enviable life, but you would be wrong. On the contrary, my life as a young boy growing up was far from happy. And the only redeeming aspect of my childhood was the beautiful scenery that surrounded our cabin and, of course, the wildlife, which I just loved. I would spend countless hours wrapped up in the awe of nature and exploring the beautiful forests that surrounded our property. The nearest neighbours to our home were miles away, so yes, we were extremely remote. My family was exceedingly poor in those days. I was the eldest of 6 other siblings that were much younger than myself. There were times we literally would go to bed hungry with our stomachs growling, but my mother did everything that she could to prevent that from happening. Every menial job that my father would take in town, he was fired from, and he was lucky if he managed to hold down a job for more than 3 days. You see, my father was a drunk, and he was a nasty, horrible, monstrous kind of human being. Any money in our home he would lavish on himself, spending every last penny on alcohol, and he really did not care less whether the rest of the family went hungry or not, as long as he got his alcohol. That was all that mattered. I grew up with an intense hatred for my father. There were times that I would go to bed feeling a sense of helplessness and wishing with all my heart that I could literally blow my father's head off with a shotgun. Believe me, I fantasized about that all the time. I know that makes me sound like a horrendous person, but I want to assure your listeners that if you had witnessed what my father did to my mother on a nightly basis, you would definitely share my intense loathing for the man. Yes, you guessed right. He was almost always drunk, and he would beat my mother up on a continuous basis. Every night when I would go to bed, I could hear my father beating my mother so loudly and so hard that the lashes could be heard from my own bedroom, which I shared with 3 of my other siblings. We would all sit up listening to the loud lashing sounds coming from the living area, and we tried to cover up our ears so that we did not have to listen to the agonizing cries that would come from my mother. My younger siblings would cry in distress, but I would always beat back my own tears and sit back silently on the bed, frozen in time, as I listened to my mother's dreadful sobs. "You stupid, stupid woman!" I would hear my father scream. "You ugly, stupid, pathetic woman! Look at you! This is not edible," he would shout. "Disgusting food! You are a lousy cook," he said, throwing the food on the floor. Believe me, my father shouted, undermined, and did everything he could to destroy my mother both emotionally and physically. And the worst part of it all was that she simply could not fight back. Sometimes we would wake up to find my mother with a black eye or a broken rib or something else. Of course, we were never allowed to tell anyone what had really happened to my mother. She would tell people at the local church that she was just very accident prone. You may ask me why I did not stand up to my father, but believe me, I did, and I ended up worse off than my mother. Once he beat me so much that I literally could not walk for an entire week. My mother told me that she could fight her own battles on her own, and if I was not careful, my father would kill me. So she begged me to stay out of the domestic abuse that she received on a daily basis. One day I returned home from a short trip to the forest where I had spent some time at a little creek watching the deer come by and drinking. It was something I always loved to do. I returned to find the house filled with the wrath of my father. "You stupid woman! I'm not drunk," he screamed. "When did I last drink?" He would lie. "Look at these bottles," he said, pointing to the beer in the house. "They've not been touched," he would say. "If I was a drunk, don't you think I would have drunk them already?" My mother would never say anything. We all knew only too well that the beer bottles in our house were filled with spring water, and my father had carefully managed to replace the caps on the bottles so they still looked as if the bottles had never been drunk. I knew where my father kept his stash of alcohol beverages. He had a secret place in the woodshed where he would hide all the beers and alcohol under piles of firewood. On many nights, my mother would go out into the valley outside of our wooden cabin and cry, and it would break my heart to listen to her pain. I knew how hopeless her situation had become with my abusive father. It was well known that my father had been having numerous affairs with women in the town, because when he was sober, which was not very often, he rarely knew how to turn on the charm. My mother was always pleased when he was having an affair, because those were the times he tended to ignore her and not be as aggressive or violent towards her. My mother told me once she had always hoped that my father would leave her for one of the women in town because she could be well and truly free from his clutches. She knew she could not risk leaving my father because he would probably find her and kill her. We were in no doubt that this would happen because my father was a fiercely jealous and possessive person by nature. One night we started to hear all kinds of horrible clapping sounds around our cabin. It was like something or someone was trying to get in. We knew it was not a bear because they did not make noises like this. When we heard these noises, we were all very fearful and would run to my mother's arms for comfort and support. You may wonder why my father did not do anything about the noises that we heard outside, but usually when they happened, he was completely passed out in a drunken stupor and snoring loudly on the couch, oblivious to anything happening around him. Night after night, we would hear the same clapping noises around our cabin, sometimes followed by the most horrendous scream that literally went through our whole bodies. What the heck was that, I would think. One night, my father was still in a drunken rage, but had not yet fallen asleep at this particular time. On this occasion, the clapping and the bashing against our cabin started all over again. My father, in his drunken stupor, opened the cabin door with a firearm in his arms and fired several warning shots in the air. The next thing I knew was my father started to scream, and then I could hear his scream grow fainter and fainter, as finally it just vanished. After the first scream my father made, I had instinctively opened the door myself to see what was going on, and in horror I watched a scene that I will never ever forget for as long as I shall live. I saw a huge gargantuan creature. He was about 9 feet tall, and he was bigger than a grizzly bear in stature and in width. His shoulder and arms were massive and hung down from beyond his knees. He was a humanoid-like creature with ape-like qualities that I could see clearly in the moonlight, like the distinctive cone-shaped head. His whole body was covered with brown hair, and I saw that he had slung my father, who was screaming, over his shoulders, and was disappearing into the eastern part of the forest. Every stride he took was so huge that one footstep of his was equivalent to about 5 feet of ours. My father was dead, of that I was certain. How I knew that, I do not know, but I knew it without any doubt in my mind. My mother asked me what had happened and where was my father, but I shrugged my shoulders and told her nothing. The following day, armed with the shotgun my father had fired the previous night, that was now lying on the ground in front of the cabin, I ventured into the eastern part of the forest, which was where I had seen the creature disappear. To avoid making the story too long for you and your listeners, I did find a place in the woods that looked like it could be a nesting area for the creature I had seen the night before. It was a large area covered with grasses, leaves and twigs, and it looked like it had been flattened by a large animal that had clearly been sleeping there, so I thought. I could see something lying submerged beneath the bracken and the twigs, and curiosity got the better of me, and so I pushed the bracken aside to see what it was. Lying in the nest was my father's foot. I knew that ugly hairy foot pretty well, and it unmistakably belonged to my dad. What I did next will surprise you and your listeners. I took my father's foot in my hand and retreated out of the forest as quickly as I could. I was terrified that the creature might see me and come after me. My heart was pounding, and I do not remember a time in my life that I have ever felt such terrible fear, because it was palpable. I finally found my way home and was so relieved not to have been followed by the creature I had seen the previous night. I was terrified that he might come after my scent and finally kill me in the same way that he had devoured my father. As strange as this sounds, I took my father's foot and buried it on our land. I know that's crazy, but I did not want anyone to know what had transpired or what had happened to my dad. Besides, I thought no one would ever believe me, even if I told them. After a few days of keeping a secret, I finally did come clean to my mother and told her in detail what had happened. My mother told me to dig up my father's foot and place it somewhere where it could be found by the authorities. This way, she told me, the finger of suspicion would not be laid at our door. Then one day the police chief and his partner came to our home to tell us that they believed that our father's foot had been found and that he must have been killed by a bear. My mother pretended to cry, and the police officers comforted her and went away, and after they left, my mother and I danced on the kitchen floor with glee. It was now well and truly over. My monstrous father was dead, he was never coming back, and the authorities had labelled the death an accident. To cut a long story short, days after my dad's death, his foot was buried in a grave on our land. We never ever bothered to give him a headstone. We were so glad he was dead, and so were all the siblings. Life suddenly started to change, and it became beautiful for us. Our little log cabin was filled with laughter and singing night after night, and there was not one occasion where we went to bed hungry or sad. As ironic as this story sounds, my mother eventually married the police chief in our town, who sadly had lost his previous wife to a bout of pneumonia. which was very common in those times. He was the gentleman that came and told my mother about the gruesome discovery of my father's foot. We all moved into a wonderful log cabin to a fancier part of town, and I gained 3 more brothers and 2 sisters. The rest of my childhood was absolutely wonderful. I never ever forgot the hairy monster, which I now know was a Bigfoot. In a strange way, as horrendous as the creature may have been, he did change my whole family's life in a positive way. So that is the end of my Bigfoot encounter. I would truly appreciate remaining strictly anonymous. Yours truly. Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful story. I've got such a lovely story for you tonight that you're just going to love. I love you guys so much. Thank you for subscribing to my channel. I just appreciate it so very much. And we've got a wonderful story for you tonight. So let's get started. It's from Jennifer from rural Kentucky. So all you people living in Kentucky, this is for you. Dear Sarah, my name is Jennifer and I grew up in rural Kentucky on 150 acres of land. Our home was literally parked in the middle of the woods and it was beautiful. I have so many wonderful memories of my childhood, fishing with my dad and joining him on the hunt, and also rescuing little orphaned animals in the woods. And believe me, there were many that needed my tender, loving care. I was homeschooled by my mother, so the only friends Tammy, my sister, and I made were children we met through church who would come and play at our home on a regular basis. When I was 8, I had a little boyfriend called Tommy, who said I was the only girl he liked because I was not obsessed with dolls like other girls were. I pretended to hate dolls so that he would like me, but when his back was turned, I always played with dolls unbeknown to him. One day he came to play at my house, and we wandered into the woods without my mother knowing. Before long, we had a big fight, although it was so long ago, I have no recollection of what we were fighting about, but something very pathetic, I suppose. Tommy pushed me over, and I literally went rolling down the stony elevation of land and ended up grazing my knee badly. I remember sitting there howling while Tommy made his way back to the cabin, leaving me all on my own. I remember my knee was hurting badly, it was bruised and bleeding, and I started to hobble along the path with great difficulty. The next thing I knew was I was being lifted up by this big creature. I remember being at a much higher elevation off the ground than when my mother and dad would pick me up because this creature was very big. I really thought it was a man dressed up as a monkey, and so I started to giggle because I thought it was ever so funny. I remember even tugging the hair on the creature's face because I thought it was all fake. The creature put me down near the cabin and my mother saw me hobbling around as she opened the door. When I told her that little Tommy had pushed me down, my mother was angry with him, but he denied it, as little boys often do. Neither of us mentioned we'd been in the woods because we knew we'd been in even more trouble. I remember asking my mum about the man in the monkey costume, and she told me that my fall had made me see things. I remember another time, as a little girl, I dressed up in my mother's high heels and pretended to be a teacher with a miniature blackboard outside at the cabin. As I was playing teacher, as we called the game, I remember seeing these brown eyes watching me curiously behind a tree. I suddenly saw this little creature. He was of no more than 2.5 feet, and he was covered in hair and had long arms like a monkey. When I saw him, he stood upright like a human would and looked like a miniature version of the monkey man I had encountered the previous time when Tommy pushed me over. The creature was startled because I'd seen him, and he leapt up a branch like a monkey and scuttled up to the treetops. I remember telling my mother about the monkey in the tree, but she never believed me until one day she was washing the dishes at the kitchen sink, and that was when she saw the larger creature. She saw the creature look at her and just walk into the woods with such grace, not looking back once. I remember she got on the phone to tell Dad that she had seen a Bigfoot in the woods and that the creature was in fact real. My dad came home and they wandered out in the woods to look for signs of the creature, but only found a very degraded footprint which was exceptionally large, about 18 inches to be precise. My mother was curious about what she had seen, but my dad was concerned and told us that none of us were allowed in the woods unless he accompanied us. One day, when I was 15 years old, my sister and I were swimming at the creek, and as I was in the water, I felt these two hairy hands pulling me under the water and then releasing me. I was so scared I tried to run out of the water, but it happened all over again. Then it also happened to my sister Tammy. She started to scream and yell and ran out of the water as fast as she could. At that moment I thought I saw a little rock moving in the water, but it was the cone-shaped head of a Sasquatch coming up for air. With his hair so wet he almost looked like an otter. I watched the cone head disappear under the water again, and I ran out before he ducked me under the water. I think he was playing with us and did not mean us any harm, but as far as games go, being ducked under the water is not fun. I guess the creature must have been a juvenile, but I only got a brief look at his head, so it was hard to tell. One thing I know from that experience is that Bigfoot can truly swim, and he's exceptionally good at it. The final time I had a Bigfoot encounter at our home was when my father came back from squirrel hunting. I must have been 17 at the time, and he had half a dozen squirrels strung together that he left on the front porch to appease my mother. You see, my mother hated him squirrel hunting because she liked the creatures, and so she hated Dad killing them. That night I heard a noise on the patio because I'm a very light sleeper, and so I tiptoed to the window that overlooked the patio area to see what was going on. I saw the silhouette of the Sasquatch in the moonlight stealing all Dad's squirrels. I knew my mother would be pleased to see them gone. I could not get a close view of the Bigfoot apart from his distinctive cone head, long arms and huge body. It literally took him seconds to steal the squirrels, which he slung over his shoulders, and he scurried away very quietly, almost gliding along the grass. I watched it scale a 6-foot fence as if it was nothing, and then just disappear into the woods. Needless to say, my dad is convinced my mother threw away his squirrels, and so he has lost interest in squirrel hunting because he believes Mum disposes of all his offerings. I even heard him tell a friend once that there is no use hunting if you're married to a softie that thinks standing on an ant is a murderous act. His friend laughed and said, "Well, at least your wife can cook. Anything my wife makes turns to charcoal and dust because she burns everything." So there you are, that's my Bigfoot story. I believe the ones near us mean us no harm. I've been lucky to have had a few sightings over the years, but I think they stay out of our way, but I believe they're always watching us. I once went to a monkey sanctuary with my dad, and we did not see a single monkey until the food came out. Then suddenly, from nowhere, there were hundreds of monkeys all around us grabbing food. You see, they've been watching us all along. I think Bigfoot knows a lot about humans, and I think he watches us all the time, but is so brilliant at camouflaging himself, so that even when he's in plain sight, we simply don't see him. Hope you enjoyed my story. Thank you for your lovely story. I've got a lovely story for you today, and it's all about the power of love. And any of you out there who really love your animals, you're like me, I'm crazy about my animals. I've got amazing animals and I love them to pieces. And so this story really touches my heart. And if you're an animal lover, it will for you as well. So let's get started. Bigfoot took my dog. That's what it's called. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I'm writing to you to tell you an amazing story, and it's all about the hairy man known as Bigfoot. Did I believe in him? Not really. But then why would I ever believe in something that I had physically never seen? Before I tell you my story, I need to tell you a little bit about myself and my character so that your listeners may understand why I behaved the way I did the day that Bigfoot took my dog. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kirsten and I live in Northern Carolina. I am 32 years old and my encounter happened in the fall of 2005. I am married to Douglas and have 2 girls, Tammy and Carly. My home in Carolina is very rural and I live on a large plot of land that overlooks some national forest. It is very beautiful here. One of the greatest loves of my life are my animals, especially my dog Hercules, who is a large basset hound whom I absolutely adore because he is so hilariously funny and has the most amazing personality. Before he eats a meal, he will sing for his food and sometimes even howl in a funny way. And at night he cuddles up to our 2 cats, Cheshire and Maple, and they both love cuddling up to him. He is so affectionate and he is so cute, and I love him half to death. I also have a passion for feeding the wild birds in my garden every single day. I make my own bread every day, and yes, I cook an extra loaf especially for the birds, which I butter lavishly because I want my birds to enjoy their food. And in winter, they are exceptionally grateful. I always encourage people to feed birds during the winter because they really struggle to find food at that time of the year. Believe me, every morning at the same time every day, all kinds of birds visit my garden, and it's a delight to behold. Sometimes I will sit in my living room watching them eating my bread with my binoculars for hours on end, and believe me, I have had some unusual bird guests in my garden. Luckily, my living room door is very close to the feeding area for the birds, and it's a glass panel sliding door that I usually leave open all day. Anyway, one day I saw this massive sparrowhawk sitting on a tree branch, and he then made a dive for one of my small birds. I raced out into the garden, screaming at the top of my lungs and gesturing angrily at the hawk. In its surprise, it dropped the little bird that was in its beak and flew away. I was thrilled to have saved my garden bird's life. You see, Sarah, that's how impulsive I am. I do have some Italian blood coursing through my veins, which is why I always seem to act before I think. But more often than not, my huge passion for living animals always ends up paying off. One day I heard that one of our neighbours had a missing hog. Then someone else had chickens that were missing. And there were animals vanishing from one person in the neighbourhood to another. And someone also had their guinea pig snatched. No one knew who the culprit was. We knew it must be some kind of animal. But this creature seemed to be very clever because despite putting up trail cams and the works, nobody ever found out who was taking our animals. And it always seemed that the trail cams were moved out of the way so that we couldn't actually see who the culprit was. I was also finding that all the apples on my tree just vanished in a single night, and only the very top ones at 18 feet off the ground remained on the tree. I was also finding that vegetables were being pinched from my organic vegetable bed, especially tomatoes and carrots. It was all very weird. One day I was having coffee and pumpkin pie with one of my neighbours when she showed me a couple of photographs she had taken of a huge footprint that she found outside her pig pen the very night one of her pigs vanished. "It looks like a human footprint, but it's huge," I said. "It was massive, about 5 times the size of somebody's feet. I mean, it was about 19 inches. It cannot be human," I explained. One day it was early evening and I was attending to my vegetable bed while my beautiful dog Hercules started to behave very strangely. He was growling and looking in the direction of a large hedge in my property. I looked over at the hedge and thought I saw some kind of movement, but I told myself I was mistaken and returned to my gardening unconcerned. I then heard the loudest, most terrifying scream coming from my basset hound. I'd never in my whole life heard my dog make such a terrifying call, and I never want to hear that noise again. It was the sound of an animal facing its inevitable demise. It was a sound of raw terror that was so tangible you could feel it literally going through every bone of your body. I jumped up to my feet as fast as I could. I did not care what this creature was. It could have been a lion. I did not care. But no one, and I repeat, no one, was going to take my basset hound from me. I saw him in the early evening shadows. He stood on 2 feet and he was about 10 feet tall, with gargantuan proportions that were beyond belief. He was much, much bigger than a large bear, and he was agile and fast on his feet. His body was covered with human-like hair, but thicker and very, very tangled. The creature had thrown my dog over his shoulder as if he was a sack of potatoes, and my dog was screeching in fear. I ran towards the creature, screaming louder than I've ever screamed before. I screamed with such anger and fury, and the sound that came out of my mouth was a sound that I have never been made before and never since. "Put him down! Put him down! Put him down now!" I sounded like a predator about to kill. My demeanour that night was fearless because of the incredible love I have for my beloved dog. In that moment, The creature was not going to intimidate me, no matter what, and my body language expressed my fearless determination to tackle this creature head on, even if I risked my own life. That's how I felt. I saw the red eye shine in the creature as he turned around to look at me, and his eyes met mine for a moment. I do not know what he saw when he looked into my eyes and witnessed the full gravity of my obvious rage. This creature just dropped my dog on the ground and literally sped away so fast, scaling my 8-foot fence as if it was nothing. My beautiful dog ran towards me, and I lifted him up into my arms and cradled him. I rushed him into the house, locking the glass doors securely behind me. I know what I saw that night was a Bigfoot. I saw him as clear as day, and I know without a doubt that I gave him a huge scare. I doubt he was scared of humans at all, but I think my behavior knocked him off guard, and he was not as sure of himself in that moment. I think he forgot in that moment that he had the power to take me out with a single swipe of his massive arms. I thought of a typical scenario for a comparison. My friend had a fearless Pekingese dog, and the Rottweiler down the road is terrified of him because this little plucky Pekingese is so assertive, bold and fearless. I think the fact that the little dog acts like he's a big dog makes the larger dog think he is big, and he becomes intimidated. To cut a long story short, my dog has finally recovered from the shock, and I believe he knows I saved his life that day. He hangs around me all the time now because he truly sees me as leader of the pack, as Cesar Millan would rightly say. I have truly earned my position as leader of the pack. Even though my dog was slightly bruised from being dropped from such a height, miraculously he did not break any bones, nor is he any worse for wear. Anyway, I hope your listeners like my story. I think I overcame Bigfoot that day because of the power of love. That was a wonderful story. Thank you so very much. We've got a wonderful Bigfoot encounter, which you're really going to enjoy. And I just want to say, guys, I love you, listeners. You really are a special breed. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I'm writing to tell you about my Bigfoot encounter, which happened to me very recently in August of 2018, here in Madison, Kentucky. We live here in a decent-sized home off one of those rural back roads, and we have a plot with a substantial amount of land. Our property borders another home that has long since become abandoned. The people just up and left their property without even taking any furniture with them. Rumors abounded around town that the old place was haunted, and that was why the people had rushed away. I do not blame people for making up stories like that, because from the outside the place really did look like it could be haunted. It had that horrible, formidable, airy feeling about it. Nobody knows where the family went. I never personally knew them myself, but I wondered if they just ran out of finances to pay their mortgage or something. I mean, why would you just up and leave your property and never come back to it ever again? It seemed extraordinary, to say the least. Anyway, I have 2 children of my own. One is called Amy and the other is called George, who are 7 years old at the time. They are both twin siblings, and ever since they were born, they have been inseparable. My children would love to spend hours playing out of doors like every children does. And they always seem to have a great deal of fun. They know how to entertain themselves. I don't ever know what they're getting up to because they tend to whisper and giggle all the time. And they're always up to mischief and look as if they're keeping a whole lot of secrets from me. As their mother, I don't mind as long as they stay out of trouble and behave themselves. After a while, I noticed a few strange things about my children that were a little bit on the bizarre side and worried me ever so slightly. When I was cleaning their room, for instance, I opened Amy's drawer and found some weird kind of things inside it. There were things like feathers, a few smooth-looking river pebbles, a mandible bone of a sheep, another kind of carcass of which I couldn't describe what kind of animal it was, a bird's nest with a couple of unbroken eggs in it. Well, I have to say I smelt the bird's nest and the stench was so unpleasant, so I immediately placed it into a plastic bag and threw it away as hastily as I could. When Amy discovered that I had thrown out her bird's nest, she threw a huge hissy fit and refused to eat her dinner that night in retaliation. and that meant her faithful brother joined in the boycott because he always has his sister's back. Needless to say, I was not happy with their behavior. Another bizarre thing was that they both appeared to be eating me out of house and home far more than two children of 7 should be doing. They would be asking for more and more sandwiches, donuts, and bananas in large amounts, which was peculiar. So imagine my frustration when one day I was cleaning their rooms and I found a stash of stale donuts and dried up old sandwiches that were molding in the cupboard, hidden under their PJs. I was furious. What on earth were they doing collecting all this food and allowing it to rot? One day, the teacher at the local school phoned me up. She told me that she was worried about my kids. I asked the class to draw a picture of an animal that they loved, a cuddly animal that they loved from home, and your children, both of them, drew a horrific creature that looked just like a demon. I just thought you should know about it, and I do recommend you get your kids to show you the pictures that they drew. I thanked the teacher and wasted no time in studying the pictures my kids had drawn. The teacher was absolutely right. The creature looked horrible, just like a monster. And it was not a cuddly pet, not like our beautiful little Yorkshire Terrier, which I thought they should have drawn. When they were eating macaroni and cheese at dinner, I did ask them what they had both drawn in class. What are these scribbles that you've drawn on the creature that look a little bit like spikes? I asked. Hair, they both said at once. What is this creature that you have drawn? It's a monkey man, silly, giggled Amy. Who is Monkey Man? I asked. He's our friend, she said. I began to wonder if they had an invisible friend like a lot of young kids do, and so I didn't give the matter any further thought. One day when the kids were playing outside, I suddenly heard my daughter let out the shrillest cry. And let me tell you, when you're a mother and you hear your child scream like that, it puts the fear of God right through you. I was terrified and ran into the garden as fast as I could. My daughter, Amy, was crying. Tears were pouring down her tiny little face, and she was holding our wet, bedraggled Yorkshire Terrier, Tammy, in her hands. What's going on? I asked. Suddenly I noticed a massive dead snake, a boa constrictor, and it was lying dead on the grass, and it had been ripped in two. It was extraordinary. I'd never seen anything like that. The big snake! Mummy! The big snake! She cried. He was trying to kill Tammy, Mummy. He tried to kill Tammy. He put his body around Tammy. He was squeezing her so tight, Mummy. He nearly killed Tammy. Poor little Tammy was in a dreadful state and was whimpering and shaking. Poor little thing, I thought, taking the Yorkshire Terrier into my arms. She was shaking with fear. I regarded the massive dead snake lying on the ground, torn in half, with horror. Wow, who could have done this, I thought. I suddenly remembered the day when 2 of the teenage boys who lived in the abandoned house next door had come to see me. We're looking for our pet boa constrictor. He got loose. We wonder if you've seen him. I told them that I'd be on the lookout for him and would let them know if he turned up. I will admit the idea of a pet boa constrictor wandering around did leave me feeling extremely uncomfortable. I now realized that the thing had been having a good time, getting really fat, hiding somewhere, feeding off rats and vermin. Now it had turned its ravenous intentions onto bigger prey, like Tammy, my Yorkshire Terrier, and this was beyond funny. I soon forgot about the snake and how it had been mysteriously torn up, because my priority was to calm down my Yorkshire Terrier. I immediately took Tammy to the vet, who could tell that the poor dog had indeed been literally smothered by a constrictor. Luckily, he said that the throat wasn't crushed and that the body wasn't too badly bruised, and that the good news was that she would make a full recovery. One thing he said that I'm curious about is, how did you manage to get the constrictor off your dog? Was he still loose, he asked, because those snakes, when they hold on tight, they squeeze the living daylights out of their prey, and they would be hard to loosen. His words echoed over and over in my head. How did my children get that constrictor off my dog? And how was that constrictor just ripped in half like that? Because it was enormous. And how could it have just been torn into 2 pieces? My children could never have done that, I thought. When I asked my children who had taken the snake off our dog, they told me it was Hairy Man.
He lives next door, said Amy. He's the one that gave me the bird's nest. Remember, the one that you were so horrible and you threw it away from me? Well, he gave me that bird's nest.
I suddenly thought that some homeless vagrant had moved into the next door house and had set up home there.
We give him sandwiches and donuts and bananas, 'cause he likes them, Mum.
What's his name? I asked them.
He does not talk, giggled Amy. He hides from us and runs away, and he plays peekaboo with us. Mummy, guess what? We see him eating bugs and worms. He pulls them out of the ground and he puts them right in his mouth, even with the dirt right on them, Mummy. He's really likes his worms.
What kind of a vagrant was this, I thought. He really must be desperately hungry to be eating bugs and worms. I immediately decided to prepare a large hamper of homemade goodies to say thank you to the vagrant that was living next door for saving my dog's life. I opened the creaky, badly rusted gate of the abandoned property, and I walked up the dirt pathway that was now overgrown with weeds and thicket. It was certainly in disarray from obvious neglect, which was really sad. I called out to the man, Excuse me, excuse me, hello there, hello, I called out loud. Then I heard a thumping sound, and this frightened face emerged from the shadowy undergrowth, and it looked at me in terror, like a wild-caught cat that is being hunted down. What on earth was this creature, I thought? This is no vagrant. And he was enormous. What happened next only lasted seconds. The creature stood up. As I said, he was enormous, and he was covered with thick but fine golden brown hair. And his face had an ape-like look to it, and yet it was distinctly human too. Put it this way, if it was possible to mix the human DNA with a giant ape DNA, perhaps the outcome would have been this creature. He was about 7 foot in height, 500 pounds, and looked like he was very massive in stature. He had a cone-shaped face, grey leathery skin, deep-set eyes, and a thin mouth and flat, squashy nose. He looked at me for only a second, stood up, and then got up on all fours and raced across the garden. He was definitely more afraid of me than I was of him. You see, it had not dawned on me that this creature was a Sasquatch. It was the furthest thing from my mind, it really was. I put the basket on the ground and went to investigate inside the house. It was filthy, and in the stench in the house was beyond anything I can describe. It was revolting. When I looked around, I found a large, big animal nest on the kitchen floor. It was a nesting area which I imagined was where the creature was sleeping. It was covered with twigs and wild grasses, and strewn over the floors were the bones and carcasses of small animals like squirrel, rabbit, and hare. And on the floor was the dead boa constrictor. One half, I imagined the other half, he had already eaten. It was only later that I realized that my children had somehow been gifting a Sasquatch with sandwiches and donuts and bananas, and he had been returning the favor with feathers, stones, and bird nests. On reflection, I do think this creature was highly intelligent, and I think he realized that my daughter Amy was upset about the snake on Tammy, so he killed it. He just tore it off Tammy, and then he ate half of it. I think it was incredible that he was able to tear that creature in half the way that he did, because I know of no animal that is capable of doing that. Why he was afraid of me, I do not know. He was certainly an intimidating creature and could be dangerous, I suspect. I did wonder where the rest of his family was. One thing I knew was that he had intervened to help my child and rescue little Tammy from the tightening grip of a massive snake, and for that I am truly and forever grateful. I'd love to know the hairy man's story and why he came to be living at the property next door. Luckily, only a couple of months ago, that house, that neglected, abandoned house, was bulldozed and brought to the ground, as it was made up previously of bricks and mortar, and a new wooden house has been replaced, and the original building has been replaced by this new wooden house. And now I have new neighbors who appear to be very, very nice and very friendly. No one in our neighborhood has reported any Bigfoot sightings, so I don't know where the hairy man is. But wherever he is, I hope he's happy. I will be eternally thankful for what he did the day when he saved little Tammy from the fearsome predator. So I hope you and your listeners enjoyed my story. What a wonderful story. I've got a fantastic story for you tonight that happened to a young girl when she set her Wendy house on fire. And I think you're going to love this story. Let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Autumn. I cannot believe I'm doing this. That is telling you about my Bigfoot encounter, because I have never told anyone this story, not even my husband, for fear of being ridiculed, especially as I have a high-profile position in the community. Let's just say I live in a rural area in southern Mississippi, where the nearest farms are about 3 miles away. That's all I'm going to say, nothing more. Growing up, I was a very outdoorsy sort of person, and I loved hiking and exploring, and sometimes I've even joined my father on seasonal deer hunting, although I've never hunted anything myself. I just love animals too much. I will eat meat, but killing an animal, I cannot stomach that. And I believe it may have a lot to do with my Bigfoot story. So here goes. My story happened in the 1970s, and that was a wonderful time to grow up because people had so many less hang-ups than they do today. Life was a lot more peaceful, more easygoing and relaxed. In those days, I had 2 sisters, both a year younger than each other. I was the eldest. My second younger sister was called Elaine, and the youngest was called Catherine. On Elaine's birthday, my parents gave her this huge, lifelike baby doll, the most beautiful doll that I had ever seen in my life. And they also gave her a wardrobe of clothes to dress her doll with. My sister called her doll Anna and spent countless hours playing with her. I would beg her to let me play with her doll, just for a few minutes, but to no avail. My sister simply refused to let me even hold her precious doll. One day when my sister was clearly distracted, I took my golden opportunity to play with Anna. I snatched the large doll from her bedroom, wrapped her in my arms like a loving mother would, and ran to the outdoor shed, which my father had converted into the most magnificent Wendy house. The Wendy house was set back in the furthest part of the garden, that was where the woodsy side was, and was surrounded by lots of trees, thick brush, and long grasses. However, inside the Wendy house was any girl's dream, because it was stunning. There were toys, telephones in there, little tables and chairs, and miniature teacups and teapots, and the list goes on. I do not remember all the details, but I know I was playing with the teacups and pretending to give Anna tea, and I do remember deciding to light a fire to keep Anna warm, because it was a cold day. I think I put some pieces of kindling together, as I'd watched my father do on many occasions when he started a fire in our home, and so I copied my father by doing exactly the same thing in the Wendy house. Within seconds, I kid you not, the Wendy house was engulfed in flames, and it happened so quickly, and my memory of that is so vague, but what happened next will be etched in my memory for life and is something I will never forget. I started to cry because I couldn't get out of the Wendy house. The flames were raging in front of the wooden door, and I couldn't get out. In that moment, I heard this crashing sound, a sound of like a force being pushed through wood. And then this wood in the Wendy house broke into a sizable opening, and it was done in seconds and with such ease. Something a human would never be able to do, but would need some heavy-duty tools to literally rip open that Wendy house. The next thing I knew was that these sausage-like fingers were holding me in their grasp, and I felt a warm, soft chest cradling me like a baby. I know it was a woman's chest because I could feel her soft breast against my body. Then I looked up into the face of the largest monster that I've ever seen. The face was like a hairy gorilla, but it also had human-like quality to it. Like a gorilla that you would see at the zoo, but much, much more human than that. The creature was covered in dark brown hair and had dark eyes. She kept chattering to me, and the noise that came out of her mouth was both calming and soothing. I just remember feeling safe in her arms, and her eyes were loving. They just talked to me, and I felt a kind of telepathic communication, as if she was telling me that everything was going to be okay.
The next thing I knew was I could hear my mother running from the house in her boots, screaming loudly as she saw the treehouse ablaze in flames. And she knew I was inside that house. The creature placed me on the ground and pushed me towards my mother's screaming voice. Before I knew it, I was in my mother's arms, and she was sobbing loudly. "I thought I'd lost you," she cried. "I thought you were dead." Later, my mother marveled that there was a huge opening in the Wendy house where I had escaped. I don't understand how this happened," she said. I explained that a hairy lady monster had rescued me, but my mother just laughed. "You were rescued by an angel," she insisted. She believes in that sort of thing because she's very religious. Needless to say, I knew differently. All these years later, I know that it was a Bigfoot that saved my life. I remember getting into a lot of trouble, rightly so, for playing with matches. But the worst thing that still bothers me, even today, as an older woman, is that my sister Elaine still believes I was jealous of her doll. I was determined to burn it. It upsets me that she would think a little girl could be that malicious. I just innocently wanted some time to play with her doll. I know there are terrifying stories out there about Bigfoot, but I believe, like people there are going to be good ones and bad ones, aggressive ones and peaceful ones. I believe the Bigfoot that rescued me had a mother's instinct. If it was not for her actions on that day, one thing I know for certain is I would not be alive, because that Bigfoot saved my life, and I will be eternally grateful for her and what she did. I still remember those kind, loving eyes to this day. Thank you, Sarah, and your listeners for hearing my story. Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.